Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into one of the most sprawling, tangled myths of Norse storytelling, and we are going to do it in the most boring, sleep-inducing way possible. We are going to talk about Yggdrasil, the World Tree, the giant ash that supposedly held together every single realm of Norse cosmology. Imagine it standing before you, branches too high to see the tips of roots, so deep they seem to pulse beneath the earth, and a trunk so wide that you could walk around it for days without circling all the way. It is enormous, eternal, and central to everything the Norse believed about the structure of the universe. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this journey because it stretches across 9 realms, a couple of serpents, and more destiny weaving than anyone asked for. But don't worry, that's a good thing, because it means you'll fall asleep before you even reach the second route. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love for you to comment your location and the local time down below. It's strangely comforting to see where everyone is listening from and what time zone this sleepy ramble is hitting. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin standing at the base of Yggdrasil, where the bark feels impossibly rough, like stone that has grown tired of being rock and decided to sprout upward into wood. The air is dense here, hushed as if no wind dares disturb the tree. The ground beneath you is firm, though in Norse imagination this base is not really earth, as we know it is the very axis of reality. They pictured Yggdrasil not just as a tree, but as the frame that keeps all existence from sliding apart into chaos. If you tilt your head back, you notice branches stretching toward Asgard, the home of the gods. Though from this angle they look more like wisps of cloud pressed into twigs. The Norse people lived with actual, tangible trees, everyday oak groves, birches near the fjords, ash trees on the farm's end. Yet, when they told stories, they imagined the biggest tree possible. Not just one that scraped the sky, but one that became the sky, the land, and the underworld. There is an odd comfort in how ordinary details slip into extraordinary myth. Some scholars say the idea of Yggdrasil grew from sacred ash trees that villagers might gather around. Others think it came from the Viking habit of orienting themselves on long voyages by remembering the structure of things in threes. 3 routes, 3 wells, 3 great destinations. Historians still argue whether Yggdrasil was ever thought of as a literal place you could visit, or if it was more like a map to explain the invisible. You run your hand along the bark. It flakes slightly, leaving a dust that smells faintly of pine tar and wet soil. The Norse would have recognized this scent from daily life. Tar was used to seal their ships, to waterproof roofs, even to medicate wounds. This is what I mean grand myth is stitched together from boring, practical details. Above you, an eagle perches unseen, somewhere higher in the branches. You can't see it yet, but you sense its stillness. Beneath you, serpents slither through unseen tunnels, chewing at the roots, and between them scampers the squirrel Ratatoska, who we'll talk about later. Because for now, the tree itself deserves attention. Picture the trunk not as wood, but as a living timeline. Imagine every season layered one upon the next, thousands of rings pressed into its heart. You think of winters in Norway so dark that the sun barely peeks over the mountains, of summers when daylight never ends. The tree endures them all, holding 9 worlds steady. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts suggest Yggdrasil was always green, no matter the season. Not just a little green, but constantly bursting with leaves. Which makes you wonder, was it ever autumn there? Did it ever shed? Or was it, like that one stubborn Christmas tree someone keeps up until July, clinging to needles as if refusing to let go? You could picture Viking poets telling each other, "No, really, it's always fresh. It never rots." And their skeptical friends replying, "Aha, sure." If you lean close, you hear faint creaking, like floorboards in an old hall. This is the sound of the worlds pressing against each other. For the Norse, the tree wasn't just scenery, it was stressed, under siege. Animals gnawed at it, gods demanded things from it, and yet it stayed upright. That balance between fragility and endurance is why it mattered. Let's anchor ourselves in a bit of mainstream history here. The Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson, around the year 1220, recorded the myths in his prose Eda, which is where we get most of our detailed knowledge of Yggdrasil. He described the roots, the wells, the animals, and even the gossiping squirrel. Without his work, the image of the tree might have withered away. But Snorri was a Christian, writing about pagan pasts, so his angle may not have been entirely neutral. This is why modern historians still debate whether his Yggdrasil was more invention than preservation. Back at the base of the tree, you notice faint pathways leading outward. One points toward the shimmering halls of Asgard. Another sinks downward into shadows, toward hell, and another disappears into icy mists. Probably Jotunheim, the land of the giants. The roots are not tidy. They sprawl like veins. It's strange, despite its cosmic importance, Yggdrasil does not seem particularly glamorous. It's not covered in gold or jewels. It is just a tree. Tall, alive, busy. That ordinariness was the point. Imagine living in a world where life was precarious. Storms could sink ships. Winters could starve farms, and to explain why the universe still held together, you imagined a tree that simply kept doing what trees do. Standing, growing, creaking, never falling. And maybe that's why we still talk about it today. Because it's relatable. Everyone has leaned against a tree, or watched one outlast generations of families. The Norse made that experience the skeleton of the cosmos. The air shifts slightly, and you catch the scent of distant water. One of the roots leads toward a well, another toward a spring. But for now, you stay here, letting the idea of the tree soak into you. Each breath is slow, like sap rising. The trunk feels steady beneath your hand, and if you stay very still, almost drowsy, you begin to imagine that your own heartbeat has slowed to match the rhythm of the tree. Ancient, patient, unhurried. The world above is busy, full of gods bickering and humans working. But here at the base, time hardly moves. You find yourself now tracing the direction of one of Yggdrasil's roots. Because if the trunk was the grand pillar, the roots are the true secret. They are the veins, the anchors, the hidden tunnels that keep the 9 worlds from spinning apart. The Norse imagined 3 enormous roots, each stretching to a different, strange destination. And as you follow, you realize these roots aren't narrow little tendrils, they are thick enough to walk upon, ridged like frozen waves, and they extend farther than the eye can see. The first root winds downward into the land of the frost giants. Cold seeps up from the soil, and even though not really there just imagining you, almost want to wrap yourself in a blanket, the air grows sharper, the ground crunches underfoot like brittle ice, and you notice cracks spidering along the root as though frost has bitten into it. This root does not merely touch Jotunheim, the land of giants. It seems to share its temperament, its icy stubbornness. The second root travels outward, and under it flows the well of fate, Urgabrunna, where the Norns sit. You can't see them yet, but you sense that whatever grows from this root has less to do with soil and more to do with time. The bark looks smoother here, almost polished, as if stories themselves have been worn into it. The third root is stranger still. It stretches into darkness, down toward the dragon-filled well of H. The ground is damp here, the air humming with underground rivers. It feels slightly dangerous, like a place where no one bothers with sunlight. Beneath your feet, you swear you hear a gnawing, as though something sharp-toothed is busy chewing at the very foundations. And in fact, that is exactly what the Norse believed. Serpents forever gnawed at this root, threatening to topple Yggdrasil if ever they grew too hungry. Each root was not simply a physical structure, but a story. One tied to giants, one tied to fate, one tied to decay. Together they balanced one another. The imagery here is so practical it almost makes you smile, because in everyday life, the roots of any large tree would spread in multiple directions, anchoring against storms. Farmers in medieval Scandinavia would have seen that every day. They simply projected this familiar sight onto the canvas of the universe. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some traditions, Yggdrasil's roots leaked honeydew, not just sap, but sweet liquid that would drip down, feeding creatures, insects perhaps, or even livestock, who found themselves licking at the soil. It is the sort of detail that sounds mythical, but also feels oddly believable if you've ever noticed how sticky and sweet tree sap can be. Imagine Vikings casually telling each other, "Yes, the world tree leaks honey," and the next guy saying, "Great, does it also attract ants?" Now, about the scholarly debates. Historians still argue whether the three roots were meant to be literal geography or more symbolic pathways. Some argue that the frost giant root represented human fear of the untamed wilderness. The Norn root represented law and time, and the serpent root represented inevitable decay. Others insist they were mapped to specific mythic wells described in detail by Snorri, and still others believe the entire three-root system may have been added later to organize a story that originally was more chaotic. But let's return to your slow walk along one route. Imagine the way the bark feels. Cold, damp, ridged. A low mist creeps over it. Every step feels like moving across something both alive and ancient. You are reminded that roots not only hold trees steady, but also feed them. Yggdrasil's roots were nourished by these cosmic waters, the well of wisdom, the well of fate, and the spring of primal rivers. Each liquid gave a different kind of sustenance. making the tree less like ordinary wood and more like a living memory. If you stand still, you hear faint drips echoing through the darkness, as though the entire universe has plumbing issues. And perhaps it did. After all, the Norse believed the entire cosmos was in flux, always under threat, always shifting. The gnawing serpents weren't simply pests. They were a reminder that even the most powerful structure had vulnerabilities. Think of it like this. In the Norse imagination, the gods themselves could not repair Yggdrasil's roots. They could only delay the damage, patch it temporarily with rituals and sacrifices. Imagine being a farmer in Iceland, watching your crops fail because of a storm, and telling yourself, well, maybe one of the serpents got too greedy today. It offered an explanation, however unsatisfying, for why life was hard. Above you, the trunk hums faintly with life. The energy rising from the roots is slow but steady, like water climbing through veins. You almost imagine you can hear it, the way some people swear they can hear sap rising in spring. You breathe deeply, and the air feels damp, rich, almost heavy with potential. A mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have found that in many Scandinavian sites, people planted sacred trees right in the center of their settlements. These were sometimes ash, sometimes other species, and they served as gathering points for rituals, law courts, or community feasts. The parallel with Yggdrasil's centrality is obvious. It seems that people often needed one big tree reel, or imagined, to make sense of everything. As you keep exploring the roots, you feel an odd drowsiness, as though the steady pulse of the tree is lulling you. You picture the three great anchors, one cold and giant-haunted, one woven with fate, one gnawed by serpents. Together, they create a strange balance opposing forces that still manage to keep the trunk standing. You could almost drift off right here, comforted by the thought that even if the universe itself is precarious, it somehow manages to stay upright. You step carefully along the second route, the one that curves outward toward something shimmering. There is a faint glow, not blinding, but steady, like light reflecting off still water at dawn. This is Eswell, a pool so deep and still that it seems less like water and more like liquid memory. The Norse believed this well held all the wisdom of the world past, present, and yet to come, which, of course, raises a practical question. How does one drink knowledge? Was it flavored like oak, bark tea, bitter and earthy? Or was it clear, leaving behind no taste but filling the mind with unbearable truths? No one can say. Standing near it, the surface doesn't ripple unless the tree itself sighs. The water is so calm it makes you want to sit down, pull your knees close, and just watch. You notice faint images hovering under the surface, as though shadows of events drift their ships, sailing, swords clashing, harvests rising and failing. But every time you blink, the images fade, leaving only your own reflection staring back at you. The well belongs to a mysterious being often described as wise, but sometimes also described as disembodied because, in one story, his head alone guards the well, kept alive by magical herbs and reciting counsel to whoever approaches. This is where Odin himself once arrived, seeking knowledge. The king of the gods did not simply stroll in and drink casually. No, he had to pay a price. The tale goes that Odin plucked out one of his own eyes and dropped it into the well as payment. You can almost imagine the sound. A faint plop, swallowed immediately by the endless water. From then on, his left eye, or was it the right, remained hidden at the bottom, glinting faintly whenever the water caught a certain angle of light. Some say it still peers upward, watching unblinking. Others argue this is purely poetic. Historians still argue whether Odin's sacrifice was meant literally, or if it symbolized giving up surface vision for deeper insight. Here's a mainstream historical anchor. In Norse culture, sacrifice was a serious matter, often involving offerings of weapons, livestock, or sometimes even human lives, all given to sacred sites like bogs, rivers, or groves. The story of Odin's eye fits neatly into this pattern. Knowledge, too, required something valuable in return. It reflects a cultural truth. Nothing came for free. Now, a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest Odin didn't just drop his eye into the well, but that it still rolled occasionally, bobbing up like a coin surfacing from mud, then sinking again. Imagine leaning over and suddenly seeing an eyeball blink at you from the water's surface. Not exactly the calmest bedtime thought, but it does add a little sleepy absurdity. You lean closer to the water, half expecting to see your own secrets surface there. Instead, you notice ripples forming, though no wind stirs. Maybe it's just Yggdrasil breathing again, shifting slightly, roots pressing deeper into soil. The tree and the well are connected without the root. The well would vanish, and without the well, the root would wither. Odin's choice to give up sight for wisdom echoes through countless later traditions. Even modern scholars compare it to stories of shamans who endure physical trials, fasting, blindness, or pain to access visions. And you begin to wonder if the myth came from watching real holy men in Viking society push their bodies to extremes. Historians still debate whether Odin was imagined originally as a distant god or as the model of a shamanic leader who blurred the line between man and divine. What fascinates you here is how quiet the well remains. You expect thunder, or whispers, or glowing runes. But instead it is silent. The Norse myths often emphasized silence as a condition for wisdom. Think of how many sagas remind listeners that those who boast too loudly usually get killed, while those who sit quietly often turn out to know the most. The water has another layer of meaning, too. Wells in Norse life were lifelines. Villages depended on them for survival. They were practical, sacred, and dangerous if they failed. So it makes sense that a myth about wisdom would spring up around a well, rather than, say, a mountain or a star. A well was accessible, local, and endlessly mysterious. You never knew exactly how deep it went. Imagine Odin bending down, cupping the water, swallowing knowledge that burned in his throat like fire but left him more certain than ever. He turned away with one less eye but more sight than anyone else. It is said that from then on, he carried himself differently, his gaze deeper, his decisions sharper. But perhaps also he carried the weight of knowing things no one should. Wisdom has a price. After all, not just in eyes, but in sleepless nights. You let your gaze drift away from the well and back along the route. The bark glows faintly, nourished by the wisdom seeping into it. You wonder if the tree itself remembers everything poured into the well. Every ring in Yggdrasil's trunk might be a record of some forgotten event. Every leaf a whisper of something once thought but never spoken. The silence grows heavier. Your breathing slows, syncing with the stillness of the water. The eye at the bottom watches, or maybe it doesn't. Either way, the well remains patient, offering nothing unless you are willing to give up something first. And so, like Odin, you stand there, half tempted, half afraid, realizing that sometimes it is better to stay ignorant than to know too much. The second route of Yggdrasil, polished smooth by countless stories, leads you toward another pool, though this one feels different from Eswell. It isn't guarded by a solitary head or bound by the sacrifice of gods. Instead, it hums with the sound of weaving. A faint, rhythmic tug and pull, as if threads are being tightened across a loom you cannot quite see. This is Urgarbrunna, the well of fate where the Norns live and work. The Norns are 3 in number, though some sources claim there are more. The main trio, however, are the Dandy and Schooled. Their names roughly mean that which has been, that which is becoming, and that which shall be. Together they spin, weave, and measure the destinies of gods and men. Imagine them not as glamorous figures with golden hair and jeweled gowns, but as calm, deliberate women, perhaps a little tired, perhaps not impressed by anyone's titles. They sit by the well with water-dampened hands, pulling threads through their loom, watching strands cross and knot. If you lean close, you hear the faint clink of their spindle, a sound like needles tapping against each other in a grandmother's basket. It is soothing, repetitive, inevitable. No one escapes their weaving, not Odin, not Thor, not the frost giants, not you. That's the unnerving part. Gods might swing hammers and roar across battlefields, but 3 quiet women at a well ultimately determine what happens. The well itself gleams with pale water, and the Norns are said to scoop from it, pouring it over Yggdrasil's roots to keep the tree alive. You can picture this: 3 figures bent over, ladles dipping, water trickling down the bark. Without them, the roots would dry, crack, and crumble. Fate wasn't just a cosmic planet, was maintenance. A mainstream historical note here. In Germanic lore traditions, female figures often appeared as guardians of oaths and overseers of communal decisions. It is possible the myth of the Norns grew out of this cultural respect for women as keepers of order. Some scholars argue they were once seen less as mystical beings and more as symbolic representations of the inescapable. Flow of time later dramatized into characters because audiences prefer people over abstract forces. And now, a quirky tidbit: some medieval Christian scribes, trying to interpret these myths, compared the Norns to witches. They imagined them cackling over cauldrons, whispering curses. But the original Norse picture is far more boring: 3 women quietly weaving. Imagine trying to terrify your audience with that. Beware, there are knitters in the woods. It's hardly still, the Norse treated the Norns with respect, even awe. They didn't pray to them in the same way they did to Odin or Thor. You couldn't bargain with fate. You couldn't bribe it. The Norns weren't swayed by gifts or sacrifices. They simply kept working, weaving what had to be woven. Historians still argue whether the Norns were believed to know every detail of the future, or if they merely maintained the overall pattern while leaving some events flexible. But either way, their presence was final. Picture, if you will, a Viking family gathered round a hearth. A child asks, "Why did Uncle die in battle?" And the mother, stirring stew, replies, "Because the Norns cut his thread." Simple, direct, unchangeable. It explains tragedy without requiring a villain. Fate itself was enough. The setting around the well is surprisingly calm. The root feels firm here, as though nourished by endless washing. The air is damp but sweet, carrying a faint smell of moss and threadbare cloth. You could imagine lying down beside the well, listening to the creak of the loom, drifting into a nap while the Norns continue their eternal work. But there is also a shadow of unease, because if they can weave your life, they can also cut it. Somewhere in their baskets lies a pair of scissors, or at least the mythic equivalent. Every life thread, no matter how long or bright, eventually ends. It's a truth the Norse embraced bluntly. For them, life was not about avoiding fate, but meeting it well. The Norns pour water over the root again. Droplets glisten, running down the bark. You watch as the tree seems to shiver, leaves rustling even far above, as if refreshed. You wonder whether every choice, every stumble, every moment of hesitation is already spun into your thread. You reach for it, but of course you can't find it. You only sense it, taut somewhere in their loom. Historians still debate whether these three were unique to Norse myth, or if they were part of a broader Indo-European tradition of fate-weaving women. The Greek Moirai, the Roman Parsi, even certain Slavic figures all resemble them. Perhaps every culture, staring at the randomness of death, invented spinners to explain it. But for the Norse, theirs were tied directly to Yggdrasil, keeping the world tree alive with their watering and their weaving. You settle near the well, listening. The loom clacks again. One thread passes over another. The sound is steady, hypnotic. You let your eyes close briefly, imagining the pattern being woven. It is not a tidy grid, but a chaotic mess of overlapping strands. And yet, if you squint, there is a strange beauty to it, a eerie reminder that even tangled fates form part of a whole. The well reflects the sky now. A star glints faintly in the water. Or maybe its Odins are drifting up from the other route, peeking jealously to see what the Norns are doing. Either way, the surface smooths again. The tree creaks overhead. Time continues its slow rhythm, and the Norns keep weaving, without hurry, without end, leaving behind the gentle clink of the Norns' loom. You follow the third route, the one that feels damp underfoot and seems to breathe with a kind of subterranean heaviness. It slopes downward into the dark places where few ever dared to wander. And soon you hear it before you see it, the constant rush and churn of water echoing like a deep drumbeat. This is Yggdrasil, the boiling spring, a roiling source that feeds countless rivers, nestled at the edge of Niflheim, the world of mist and frost. But don't imagine a cheerful, bubbling spring you might find on a hiking trip. This one is far less inviting. The sound is harsh, the air thick with cold moisture, and the water isn't clear, it's heavy, steaming, a strange blend of frost and scalding heat. The Norse described it as the primal source of many rivers that ran outward into the worlds. Rivers with names that roll like distant thunder: Jael, Lipta, Yggdrasil, and many more. Too many to keep straight when your eyelids are growing heavy. The water here is life-giving in one sense, but also dangerous. Beneath the churning surface, serpents coil, not just a handful, but swarms of them, slithering over each other in endless knots. At their center lies Yggdrasil, the dragon serpent forever gnawing at Yggdrasil's root. His teeth scraped bark, his coils squeeze, his hunger never ends. The image is grotesque, but also strangely domestically. A cosmic version of mice chewing on the beams of your attic. The Norse were practical. Even the universe had pest problems. A mainstream historical note. Norse mythology often tied natural water sources to cosmic stories. Springs, wells, and rivers were sacred in everyday life because they were essential in farming and survival. Archaeologists have found votive offerings, coins, and even carved figures thrown into bogs and lakes across Scandinavia. Yggdrasil fits this pattern, turning a dangerous, mysterious spring into the literal fountainhead of worlds. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas describe the rivers flowing from Yggdrasil as freezing solid in places, sharp enough to cut flesh like knives. Imagine that water that doesn't just chill you, but slices you open if you stumble against it. It's one of those details that sounds half like myth and half like an exaggerated memory of someone falling on sharp ice in winter. You can picture a Viking telling the story while nursing a bruise. It wasn't my clumsiness, it was one of the rivers of age. As you edge closer, the mist thickens. Drops cling to your eyelashes, and every breath tastes of iron and salt. The ground squishes beneath your feet, not quite soil, not quite mud, and always there is that gnawing sound, soft, steady, teeth grinding against wood. Yggdrasil is working away. He is patient. He has eternity, after all, and though the tree still stands, the myth constantly reminds you that decay never really stops. Even the axis of the universe can be chewed on. Historians still argue whether Yggdrasil was meant to symbolize chaos, death, or simply the natural process of rot. Some suggest he represented the memory of carrion birds and scavengers that farmers would see feeding on corpses after battle. Others think he was the embodiment of resentment, gnawing endlessly at stability. Whatever the case, the Norse seemed oddly comfortable with the idea that the world tree was never perfectly safe. It lived in a state of perpetual threat, and yet it endured. The spring itself, Yggdrasil, bubbles louder. You can almost hear it hissing, like a kettle left too long on the fire. The rivers it sends outward are endless, branching through realms, carving landscapes. Some are said to carry the souls of the dead, others to border the lands of giants. They are the arteries of the world tree, pumping not blood, but cold, dangerous waters. Picture, if you will, a Norse storyteller on a long winter night, describing these rivers to a firelit hall, every name recited slowly, like an incantation. The audience would nod, half asleep, half afraid, imagining these rivers as barriers they would one day cross in death. For them, this wasn't just fantasy, it was a geography of the afterlife. And in the middle of all that, you have the image of a squirrel Ratatoss scampering back, and fourth, carrying insults between the eagle at the top of the tree and the dragon below. Imagine that, for a moment. A squirrel as cosmic messenger. It's such a delightfully mundane creature inserted into the grandest of myths. The Norse world was full of contradictions. Terror mixed with humor, grandeur tangled with pettiness. But for now, the route near Yggdrasil feels wet, uneasy. You can sense the danger of standing here too long. The serpents squirm, restless, and you imagine scales brushing against the bark, tongues flickering, eyes gleaming faintly through the mist. And yet, despite centuries of gnawing, Yggdrasil still stands. The sound is constant, the threat is real, but the tree endures. Perhaps that was the lesson. Not that destruction never comes, but that stability often survives much longer than you'd expect. You step back slightly, letting the noise fade. The hiss of water and the scrape of teeth blur together into a dull background hum. The air grows cooler again, and you realize your own breathing has slowed to match the rhythm. The root stretches back toward the trunk, steady, alive, fed by waters both nourishing and dangerous. And somewhere above, the tree's leaves shiver faintly, as though acknowledging the balance being maintained. Fate on one side, wisdom on another, decay on the third. Together, they keep the tree alive. By now, you've followed Yggdrasil's 3 routes into wisdom, fate, and decay. But if you tilt your gaze upward, you realize the tree is not only about roots and wells. It is alive with creatures, small and large, perched or crawling, each playing some strange part in the ongoing drama of the cosmos. It's almost like a busy apartment building, with everyone from the mighty eagle at the top to the tiniest insect at the bark finding a role to play. The most famous of these residents is Ratatoska, the squirrel. Now, a squirrel doesn't sound very intimidating, but this one was notorious. Ratatoska spent his days darting up and down the trunk of Yggdrasil, carrying insults between the eagle who sat high in the branches and Hggr, the dragon serpent gnawing at the roots. Imagine that. A squirrel as a cosmic messenger of petty squabbles. You can almost picture him pausing halfway, flicking his tail, and snickering as he exaggerated the words to make the quarrel worse. The eagle never descended, the dragon never climbed, but the squirrel made sure their hostility stayed alive. It's funny, really. The Norse, who told stories of giants battling gods and seas swallowing ships, also pictured the universe's stability depending on a gossipy squirrel. Historians still argue whether Ratatoska was meant to be taken seriously, or if he was a sly joke slipped into the myth. Maybe he represented the way trivial quarrels, when repeated, can undermine even the strongest structures. Or maybe he was just comic relief, something to make listeners chuckle before the story sank back into gloom. But Ratatoska wasn't the only creature. For great stags were said to live in the trees, branches, Dvalin, Dunair, and Dura. Their antlers scraped against the leaves as they fed, shaking branches, sometimes even loosening twigs. Some scholars say they symbolized the 4 winds, always moving, always nibbling at the world's vitality. Others think they represented the cycle of time, each stag tied to a phase of the day. But in practice, you can simply imagine them wandering lazily along the branches, munching leaves, like goats in a meadow, while gods bickered and serpents chewed below. And then there was the eagle itself. Its wings stretched so wide that when it shifted, breezes rippled through all the realms. The eagle wasn't given a name in most versions, which makes it more mysterious. It simply sat at the top, silent, watchful. Between its eyes perched a hawk called Yggdrasil, whose name suggests something like weather pale. You can imagine the hawk tilting its head, catching glimmers of storms before they arrived, its feathers ruffled by the wind. Here's a mainstream historical anchor. In Norse society, animals were often given symbolic weight. Eagles represented keen vision, serpents symbolized death or danger, and stags often stood for vitality and renewal. Carvings on Viking Age stones sometimes included animals twisted together in elaborate knots. Yggdrasil's creatures may have been the mythic echo of this artistic tendency, layering meaning onto the animals people saw daily in forests and farms. And for a quirky tidbit, some later folk tales claim Ratatoska sometimes deliberately gnawed at the tree himself, not just delivering insults. Imagine a squirrel with tiny teeth making his own contribution to the cosmic erosion, one bite at a time. It's almost adorable, in a destructive kind of way. The imagery of Yggdrasil's animals also hints at something bigger. The universe was static. It wasn't a neat, frozen diagram. It was messy, noisy, constantly in motion. Stags rustled the leaves, eagles flapped wings, squirrels gossiped, dragons gnawed. The tree was alive, not just in a biological sense, but in a social one. It had tenants, squabbles, diets, and rhythms. Historians still debate whether these animals were meant literally or allegorically. Were they actual mythic beings imagined as climbing on a cosmic ash? Or were they shorthand for natural forces, wind, decay, storms, gossiped that the Norse translated into animals because that made stories easier to tell? It may have been both. People don't always separate metaphor from myth as neatly as modern readers expect. For now, just imagine sitting against the trunk, looking upward. You see Ratatoska dart past, tail flicking, his claws scratching against bark like faint drumming. Higher up, a stag lowers its head, chewing slowly, eyes half closed in boredom. Leaves tremble under its antlers. Above that, the eagle adjusts its wings. A shadow moving across the sky, while Yggdrasil peers down as if measuring whether you're worth noticing. It all feels oddly domestic. The world tree isn't silent or sterilites noisy, full of petty dramas. And somehow, that makes it easier to fall asleep. Because even the cosmos, in all its grandeur, boils down to creatures doing what they do best. Squabble, chew, flutter, or gnaw. The bark under your back is rough, but warm. You close your eyes for a moment and hear the faint layers of sound. The eagle's wing, the deer's chewing, the squirrel's chatter, the dragon's teeth. It's like a natural lullaby, each part repeating endlessly, an eternal background hum that keeps the tree alive. If you've been listening closely, you've already brushed past the roots and the animals. But what Yggdrasil really holds together are the 9 realms. This is where the Norse imagination stretched widest, mapping existence not on a globe or a chart, but on the branches and roots of a single tree. These realms were not neat planets or tidy spheres. They were tangled, overlapping, sometimes contradictory. And yet they all had their place, clinging to the tree like nests or caverns. At the highest point of Yggdrasil, nestled in branches touched by light, is Asgard, home of the Aesir gods. It's the realm of Odin, Thor, and Frigg, shining with halls where feasts and councils take place. In some tales, a rainbow bridge called Bifrost connects Asgard to Midgard, flashing with colors that ripple like fire. But we'll save that for a closer look later. For now, just imagine Asgard perched up there, like the penthouse suite of the World Tree, slightly smug about its height. Nearby, but separate, lies Vanaheim, the land of the Vanir gods. The Vanir were associated with fertility, prosperity, and the softer side of divine power. After a long war between the Aesir and Vanir, a truce was forged, and hostages exchanged. Vanaheim feels quieter, more rural, more about growth and harvest than about thunder and war. Think of it as the countryside estate compared to Asgard's bustling court. Moving down a level, closer to where humans actually live, there's Midgard, the realm of men. Midgard is placed like a fenced-in yard, surrounded by the sea and shielded by gods from chaos. Its name literally means middle enclosure. To picture it, imagine farmland enclosed by hedges, only on a cosmic scale. It's where we, the listeners, supposedly sit, worrying about crops, winters, and bedtime. Beyond Midgard, on colder, harsher edges, lies Jotunheim, the land of giants. It's described as icy, craggy, mountainous, a realm of frost and stone. Giants here are not always evil, but they are always rivals, challenging the gods, intruding into Midgard, marrying into Asgard's families, or just throwing boulders because they feel like it. Jotunheim always loomed as a reminder that outside the safety of the village fence, the wilderness was vast and hostile. Then there's Alfheim, the land of the light elves. These beings are luminous, graceful, and often tied to fertility and beauty. Scholars suspect that belief in elves overlapped with folk traditions about spirits of ancestors or nature. Alfheim glimmers faintly in the branches, less solid than other realms. Almost like it flickers in and out of view depending on the angle of light. Opposite to Alfheim lies Svartalfheim, sometimes also called Nidavellir, the realm of dwarves or dark elves. Here the creatures are industrious, hammering metal, forging legendary weapons, and living in caverns that echo with clanging. If you've ever seen sparks fly from a forge at night, you can imagine the flickering glow of this world. Lower down, where the trees' roots brush shadows, is Hell, the realm of the dead. It isn't fiery or torturous. It's quiet, dim, and cold. Souls not chosen for Valhalla or other glorious afterlives drift here, dwelling under the rule of Hell, the half-dead, half-living goddess. It feels like a long twilight and pleasant, but not unbearable. And then there is Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Imagine it crackling, glowing red, its flames licking against the edges of other realms. Fire giants live here, led by Surt, who carries a sword that glows brighter than the sun. Muspelheim feels like the opposite of Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, which is our ninth world. Together, They represent primal opposites, the ingredients that clashed to form creation itself, a mainstream historical anchor. These 9 worlds were not always described consistently. Some poems mention fewer, some more. The neat number 9 likely reflects the Norse love of symbolic. Numbers 3 and 9 appear often, representing completeness. The image of 9 realms nestled in one tree may have been an attempt to make sense of scattered local traditions, gathering them into one cosmic diagram. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas suggest the gods traveled between these realms with surprising ease. Odin wandered to Jotunheim in disguise. Thor crashed into giant lands often, and Freyr once gave up his sword to win the hand of a giant. So while the realms sound distinct, in practice they were like neighbors, constantly barging into each other's houses, borrowing tools, and occasionally fighting over fences. Historians still argue whether the 9 realms were understood spatially, literally stacked on a cosmic tree, or symbolically, as overlapping states of existence. Did the Norse truly believe one could climb a tree into Asgard, or was it more of a poetic metaphor? Evidence points both ways. The beauty of myth is that it doesn't have to be consistent, it just has to work when spoken aloud in a smoky hall on a winter night. Now, picture yourself standing at the base of Yggdrasil again. You look up, and instead of branches, you see faint glimmers of each realm, like lanterns strung in different directions. Some are bright, some are shadowed, some flicker faintly. They're not aligned neatly. They sway, they hum, and they balance precariously, yet the tree holds them all. The hum of the realms is constant, a low vibration that runs through the bark. You feel it in your fingertips as you press against the trunk. It's a reminder that no world exists alone. Each is tied to another, bound by roots, branches, and the inevitable pull of fate. You tilt your head upward again, and your gaze settles on Asgard, the shining realm nestled among the higher branches of Yggdrasil. It doesn't shimmer like a polished jewel, it gleams more like a set of well-kept halls, bright in the cold sun, functional as much as beautiful. Asgard was the realm of the Aesir, the warrior gods, and it always carried an air of both grandeur and routine. When you imagine it, you might first think of Valhalla, Odin's great hall, its roof said to be thatched with golden shields. Warriors, chosen by Valkyries, gathered here, feasting endlessly, their wounds healing each evening so they could fight again the next day. But not every corner of Asgard was filled with clashing swords and roaring laughter. There were quieter halls too. Frigg, Odin's wife, held her hall Fensalir, which translates to something like marsh halls. Its name is oddly humble, almost like a house set by wetlands. Tyr, god of justice and law, kept his own steady hall. Balder, the beloved son, lived in Breidablik, described as so pure that nothing unclean could ever enter it. Each building carried personality, much like the gods themselves. The daily life of Asgard, though, was not only feasting and boasting. The gods also held councils at the foot of Yggdrasil near the Well of Fate. Imagine them walking in lines, cloaks pulled against the wind, sitting together to discuss matters of law and destiny. It almost resembles a parliamentary session, if the parliament were made up of immortals prone to mood swings and occasional brawls. A mainstream historical anchor. Some scholars think Asgard may have been modelled after real chieftain estates in Scandinavia, with long halls for feasts, smaller halls for families, and central spaces for law gatherings. The myth elevated these earthly layouts into divine scale. For a Viking, hearing these stories, Asgard may not have felt distant at all. It would have felt like the idealized version of home. And now, for a quirky tidbit. Some sagas claim that the walls of Asgard were once built by a mysterious giant mason, who asked for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya as payment. The gods, realizing too late that he might actually finish the job on time, tricked him with Loki's help. Loki distracted the mason's magical horse. The work was left unfinished, and instead of handing over payment, the gods revealed his giant nature and killed him. It's essentially the oldest story of hiring a contractor, panicking about the bill, and finding a loophole. From Asgard, the gods could look down upon Midgard, watching human affairs with a mixture of interest and interference. Odin was particularly restless, always disguising himself, wandering the realms, searching for wisdom. Thor, by contrast, often left Asgard loudly, hammer in hand, ready to smash giants. And Freya, goddess of love and beauty, sometimes travelled between Asgard and Vanaheim, riding her chariot pulled by cats. Yes, cats imagine the divine embodiment of glamour, pulled around by purring, half-sleepy animals. Historians still argue whether the gods were seen as truly immortal or merely long-lived, bound to the cycle of fate just like everyone else. After all, even in shining Asgard, doom loomed in the distance. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when their halls would burn and collapse. The image of bright feasts overshadowed by inevitable destruction reflects the Norse acceptance that nothing lasts forever, not even divine routine. But before that end, Asgard thrived in ordinary ways. You can picture the clang of weapons as warriors trained in Valhalla's courtyards. You can hear the laughter of gods trading boasts over mead. You can see Baldra's pure hall glowing faintly in the light, almost like a candle that refuses to be smudged. And in the background, Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, arched downward, connecting Asgard to Midgard, shimmering like a path of living fire. Here's something that makes you smile if you think about it too long. The gods, despite their power, still needed transportation. Thor had goats that pulled his chariot. Frey had a boar with golden bristles. Odin rode Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse born from a very odd story involving Loki shapeshifting into a mare. The details of daily Asgardian commuting are almost comical. Imagine the traffic jams if all these divine animals lined up on the Bifrost Bridge. Yet Asgard, for all its light and bustle, wasn't really separate from the tree itself. Its roots still drank from the wells below. Its leaves still rustled in the same winds that touched Midgard's farms. That was the beauty of Yggdrasil's design. Even the highest gods depended on the same balance as everyone else. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture it. Golden roofs glinting, halls stretching wide, laughter echoing like music carried on the wind. The gods move about their routines, some serious, some silly, some even a little petty. It's not the silence of eternity, but the hum of a household writ large. And while you imagine it, You feel the branches sway faintly, as though even the divine halls of Asgard are gently rocked to sleep by the heartbeat of the World Tree. From the gleaming heights of Asgard, your gaze drifts downward, through the flickering shimmer of Bifrost, towards something far more familiar. Midgard, the Middle Realm, the world of humankind. Unlike the lofty divine halls, Midgard is ordinary, patchworked with farms, rivers, forests, and shorelines. Yet the Norse treated it as precious, an enclosure of safety built in the center of chaos. The very name, Midgard, means middle yard, or middle enclosure, as though all of human life is a fenced-in homestead surrounded by wild, threatening lands. Picture a Norse settlement, wooden longhouses with turf roofs, smoke curling lazily from central hearths, animals kept close at night, and children weaving through the mud-packed yard. These ordinary details were the raw material from which the myth was formed. The cosmos mirrored the structure of a village. Humans huddled together in the middle, gods above them, giants outside, and the dead beneath. Yggdrasil was less a fantasy tree than a giant version of what they already knew: safety in the center, danger at the edges, a mainstream historical anchor. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of circular fortresses and fenced-in communities across Scandinavia, which match this worldview of an enclosure protecting against outside forces. Midgard's mythic fence wasn't just metaphor, it echoed the very real stockades and ramparts that villagers built to keep wolves, raiders, and cold winds out. But the most striking detail about Midgard in myth is how it was created. According to the prose Edda, Odin and his brothers Vili and killed the primeval giant Ymir, and from his enormous corpse they fashioned the world. His flesh became earth, his bones mountains, his blood the seas, his skull the sky. And for Midgard specifically, they used Ymir's eyebrows to build the encircling wall. Yes, eyebrows, a cosmic fence made out of giant eyebrows. You can almost hear the storyteller in a Viking hall grinning as he says it. And thus, your home is shielded by a brow so stern, no chaos can slip past. It's quirky, absurd, and wonderfully memorable. Midgard itself was imagined as a plain stretching under the open sky, ringed by seas that curled endlessly into the horizon. Ships were its lifeblood. To a Norse audience, the world wasn't measured in fields or borders, but in coastlines and fjords. The sea wasn't just a boundary, it was a highway. Yet it was also home to Jormungandr, the great world serpent, who encircled Midgard in the oceans. Tail in mouth, coiled so tightly that no one could escape. The serpent symbolized both protection and threat. If he stirred, waves crashed. If he loosened, the seas swallowed. Humans were trapped within his circle, safe yet precarious. A quirky tidbit here. Some sagas describe fishermen accidentally hooking Jormungandr while casting lines. Thor himself once tried to fish him up using an ox head as bait. The line tightened, the sea churned, and Thor braced against the boat, pulling until the serpent's head rose from the water, dripping, eyes blazing. But before Thor could land the catch, the giant with him panicked and cut the line. The serpent slipped back into the deep. And so Midgard remained encircled, the serpent biding its time. It's an oddly domestic image, gods and monsters squabbling over what is essentially a bad day of fishing. Historians still argue whether Midgard was meant to be Earth itself, as we understand it, or a symbolic realm layered on top of it. Some say it was literally the human world. Others argue it was a mythic version, existing parallel, touched but never fully seen. Either way, it was the space listeners knew best, grounded in daily survival. Life in Midgard was practical. Farmers ploughed, smiths forged, weavers spun. Winter pressed hard, summer stretched short, and storms rolled off the North Sea without mercy. In these ordinary rhythms, the myth of Midgard resonated. Humans were caught between gods above and giants beyond, but they still had their hearths, their tools, their fences. Just as Yggdrasil stood in cosmic balance, humans kept balance in their little enclosures. You might imagine standing in a Midgard meadow at dusk. The air crisp with pine, the sky streaked orange, the smell of smoke from nearby huts drifting lazily. Above you, faintly Asgard glitters like a star. Below, hell waits in silence, and around, always, the serpent coils. It gives you a sense of both safety and fragility. The world feels held together by a thin thread, yet that thread has lasted centuries. The hum of Yggdrasil carries through here, too. You press your palm to the earth, and it feels faintly alive, pulsing with the same rhythm you felt at the trunk. Midgard may not seem as glamorous as Asgard, but it is just as necessary. Without the middle enclosure, there would be no listeners, no farmers, no warriors, no storytellers to keep these myths alive. And in that realization, you feel an odd drowsiness. Because if even the gods needed Midgard to matter, then surely the daily lives of ordinary people, ploughing, weaving, fishing, were cosmic acts in themselves. The middle world, simple and fenced, is where the great tree's heartbeat is most steady. Leaving Midgard, your eyes drift outward again, past the fenced safety of the middle world into harsher, stranger landscapes. The tree's branches stretch far, and one of them dips into shadow and ice. This is Jotunheim, the land of the Jitner, the giants, but don't think of them as just oversized humans stomping clumsily around. In Norse myth, giants were elemental, raw forces of nature. Some were massive, yes, but others were cunning, beautiful, or terrifying in ways that went beyond mere size. They were the embodiment of wilderness, the outside, the unshaped. The air here is cold, sharp as glass. The land is rugged, carved with cliffs and mountains that seem to grow taller the longer you stare at them. Frost creeps along rocks, and rivers thunder through valleys, their spray freezing into glittering shards. It's a place both beautiful and inhospitable, like staring at a winter landscape that dares you to survive in it. The Gitner themselves were a mixed lot. Some were grotesque, with too many heads or too many arms. Others, however, were strikingly fair, even attractive. Many of the gods intermarried with giants, producing children who blurred the lines between worlds. Loki himself, though counted among the Aesir, was of giant blood. This constant mingling meant Jotunheim wasn't just the enemy's campit, was also the in-law's house. Awkward, tense, but impossible to ignore. A mainstream historical anchor. The idea of giants may have grown from the Norse experience of wilderness. Beyond the cleared farmland lay dense forests, jagged mountains, and glaciers. To a farming people, these landscapes felt alive, hostile, and powerful. Giants, then, became the personification of nature's unpredictability, too vast to control. Sometimes helpful, often dangerous. Here is a quirky tidbit. One saga describes a giantess named Skadi, who actually married into Asgard. She came to the gods demanding compensation after they killed her father. To settle the matter, they allowed her to choose a husband, but only by looking at the god's feet. Expecting to pick Balder, the most beautiful, she accidentally chose Nejar, the sea god, because his feet were the cleanest. Imagine choosing your partner in life based on nothing but ankles. That's Jotunheim humor for you. The landscape here hums with tension. You can almost hear distant laughter, booming and echoing across frozen valleys. The giants aren't simply villains, they are rivals, neighbors, and sometimes teachers. Odin himself sought knowledge from them, traveling in disguise, trading riddles, risking his life to gain wisdom. Thor, on the other hand, seemed to delight in storming through Jotunheim, hammer in hand, smashing skulls and proving his might. Their feuds often read less like wars and more like family disputes that got out of hand. Historians still argue whether the Jotnar were seen as a separate race or simply as older, wilder forms of gods. In many myths, they are described as the primordial beings who existed before the Aesir, before order. If Odin and his brothers shaped the world from Ymir's body, then every mountain and glacier was, in a sense, a piece of a giant. That blurs the line. Were the gods fighting the giants, or were they fighting the lingering pieces of the world's raw beginnings? As you wander across Jotunheim's icy ground, you notice that even Yggdrasil's roots seem reluctant here. They are thinner, darker, strained. The frost clings to them, gnawing at the bark, yet still they hold firm, anchoring this wild realm just as securely as they do Asgard or Midgard. The tree does not judge, it simply balances. You imagine Thor stomping through the snow, goats pulling his chariot, Mjolnir flashing in hand. His booming laughter echoes as he challenges yet another giant. You picture Odin, cloaked and hooded, sitting by a fire with a giant chieftain, trading riddles until one of them slips and reveals a secret. And you picture Skadi, striding tall, bow in hand, skiing down slopes with the speed of the wind. Jotunheim was not simply a land of enemies, it was a place of stories, of tests, of lessons. A final thought drifts through. Perhaps Jotunheim was a way of saying that the wild would never be tamed. No matter how many farms were fenced, no matter how many halls were built, the mountains and glaciers would still be there, indifferent and dangerous. The giants weren't just characters, they were in. You breathe deeply, and the air here feels sharp in your lungs, almost too cold to hold. The wind cuts against your skin, and for a moment you sense why the Norse filled these icy places with massive beings. Because, in the face of such landscapes, you too would imagine something was watching. And then, just as quickly, you feel the warmth of Yggdrasil's trunk again, steady beneath your palm. The cold fades, but the memory lingers. Giants laugh in the distance. Thor's hammer echoes faintly, and the tree continues to balance frost and flame, order and chaos, gods and giants. From the icy crags of Jotunheim, your attention drifts downward again, past the roots that stretch into shadow, into a place quieter and far colder than any frost giant's mountain. This is Hell, the realm of the dead. Unlike the fiery underworlds imagined in later traditions, Hell was not a pit of torment. It was not a place of endless flames or shrieking punishments. It was simply the place where most souls went when their time in Midgard ended. Imagine a valley shrouded in dim twilight. The air is still, damp, heavy with mist that clings to your clothes. The ground is soft underfoot, not because it's fertile, but because it's sodden, as if it has absorbed centuries of footsteps. There is no sun here, no real night either, just a perpetual greyness, a long pause at the end of life. The realm is ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki, who herself is described as half-living, half-dead. One side of her face fresh and fair, the other side pale and corpse-like. It isn't necessarily frightening, it's unsettling, like staring at something that refuses to be one thing or another. Hel sits in her hall, near whose name translates to damp with sleet. The name alone gives you a chill. You picture walls that drip constantly, roofs covered in frost, benches lined with the dead, each silent, each waiting. A mainstream historical anchor. In Norse society, death was a common companion. Infant mortality was high, winters were brutal, and battles frequent. Not everyone could expect a glorious death in combat. Valhalla may have been the dream, but Hell was the reality for most. It offered a sober, pragmatic afterlife. Not glamorous, not heroic, but steady. A place where the dead rested, undisturbed. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources say Hell's bed was called sickbed, and her threshold stumbling block. Even the furniture of the realm leaned toward irony, as though the Norse, grim as they were, couldn't resist a little dark humor. Imagine an eternal nap in a bed literally named after illness. It's both tragic and oddly comforting. The souls who entered Hell were not tortured endlessly. They simply existed. Some sagas describe them feasting, albeit without much joy. Others suggest they wandered quietly, shadows of themselves. The realm was less about punishment than about inevitability. If you died of old age, sickness, or anything other than battle, this was where you went. Historians still argue whether Hell was originally imagined as gloomy at all. Some theories suggest it was initially neutral, a resting place that only later Christian scribes reshaped into something more sinister. The word Hell itself simply means hidden or covered, which could suggest burial, not torment. In that sense, Hell was more of a grave writ large than a hellfire pit, and yet, in myths, Hell herself was no mere caretaker. When Balder, the beloved god, died, Odin sent messengers to Hel to bargain for his return. She agreed, but only if every creature in existence would weep for him. Almost all did, except for one giantess who refused, sealing Baldr's fate. That story captures Hell's power. .com, patient, unmoving. She could not be tricked, could not be bribed. Her realm was final. As you stand here in imagination, you hear no sound except the faint dripping of water. the shuffle of unseen feet, the quiet sighs of those who no longer breathe. It is not frightening, it is soporific, like the low murmur of wind in a cavern. The stillness itself becomes a kind of lullaby. Above, Yggdrasil's roots stretch through the soil, pressing into hell's damp ground. Droplets of water slide down the bark, shimmering faintly in the gloom. The tree does not shun this place. It anchors here, just as firmly as it does in Asgard's brightness. Life and death, together, balanced. You might even imagine sitting for a while, leaning against the hall's wall, listening to the silence. Your body grows heavier, slower, as if matching the rhythm of this realm. You begin to understand why the Norse accepted hell without rage. It was not something to fight. It was something to fold into, like a long, grey evening that never quite ends, but never hurts either. And in that quiet, you realize that Yggdrasil needs hell. Without endings, the tree would swell unchecked, branches tangling into chaos. With endings, the balance holds. Every death is simply another root anchored, another thread clipped, another place for stillness. You've seen the glittering halls of Asgard, the fenced safety of Midgard, the icy ridges of Jotunheim, and the grey twilight of Hell. But when you take a step back, the picture of Yggdrasil becomes less about individual realms and more about the constant tug-of-war that keeps the tree standing. It is never peaceful for long. Balance is fragile, always threatened, always maintained in the last possible moment. At the roots, Ni, Hggr, and countless serpents chew endlessly. Above, the eagle watches, silent and patient, as though measuring when the cracks will finally appear. Between them, Ratatoska stirs up insults, ensuring animosity never cools. The stags strip leaves, draining vitality. The Norns pour water, patching and repairing. The wells nourish, but they also remind everyone of the limits of wisdom and time. It is easy to think of Yggdrasil as permanent, but the myths themselves stress its vulnerability. The Norse were practical people. They had watched storms uproot trees, watched rot hollow trunks, watched insects gnaw bark until one strong wood collapsed into dust. They knew that nothing, no matter how mighty, was truly indestructible. Their cosmos reflected this realism, a mainstream historical anchor. Norse society had no illusions of eternal stability. Archaeology reveals frequent relocations of farms and settlements, often abandoned due to soil exhaustion or climate shifts. To a people whose lives were shaped by instability, a tree that was always under attack, always needing care, felt familiar. And here, a quirky tidbit. Some versions of the myth suggest that the dew dripping from Yggdrasil's branches fell to the earth as honey. Not golden nectar in jars, but sticky droplets that livestock could lick up from the grass. Imagine, then, the entire cosmos sweating sugar, feeding goats, while serpents gnawed the roots. It's an odd, almost comical detail tucked into a myth otherwise filled with doom. Yet balance was maintained not only by the tree's resilience, but by the relationships between the realms. Asgard needed Midgard's admiration, Midgard needed Asgard's protection. Jotunheim tested both, Hel provided an end, and the fiery and icy realms of Muspelheim and Niflheim pressed at the edges. The tree stood because all of these pressures were pulling at once, like ropes in a tense game where no side could afford to let go. Historians still argue whether Yggdrasil was ever imagined as a literal ash tree seen in visions, or if it was a poetic metaphor. Some scholars argue it was connected to ritual trees planted in the centers of villages, living symbols of continuity. Others suggest it was more of a mental diagram, a way to organize cosmology in story form. Either way, its threats and vulnerabilities made it relatable, not just awe-inspiring. Picture yourself sitting beneath the trunk, listening. You hear the steady drip of the Norns watering the roots. You hear the faint gnawing below, never ceasing. You hear Ratatoska's claws pattering as he scrambles past, tail flicking with gossip. The eagle's wings rustle, a low wind sweeping down. Each sound is small, but together they form a chorus, a reminder that the tree is alive, precisely because it is busy, noisy, contested. And then there are the gods themselves, who often fought to preserve balance, but sometimes threatened it instead. Thor's temper could bring storms. Loki's tricks could unravel trust. Odin's obsession with wisdom led him to risky bargains. Every choice added strain to the structure. It wasn't just animals and serpents that endangered Yggdrasil. The gods, too, were restless, unpredictable tenants. You begin to notice how this mirrors daily life. Think of a farmhouse roof patched again and again, the beams groaning under snow each winter, mice chewing at the corners, children squabbling, storms rattling shutters, and yet the house still stands, year after year. Yggdrasil is that house, scaled to the cosmos, filled with neighbors who both help and hinder. The balance is never perfect, and yet the tree doesn't fall. That tension, that precariousness, is what makes it compelling. The Norse didn't dream of a universe that was eternally secure. They imagined one that endured despite constant threats. That is a strangely comforting thought, that even if everything is gnawed, rusted, or cracked, it can still stand, still shelter, still last longer than expected. Your hand against the bark feels the faint hum again, that steady vibration that runs through the trunk. You realize it isn't silence at all, it's a layered music of strain and survival. A song of things holding together just enough. It's messy, but it works. And slowly, as you listen, your own breath falls into rhythm with it. Steady, even, fragile, but enough. You've wandered through the realms, watched the animals, felt the roots, and now you pause, noticing something curious. The way the story of Yggdrasil shifts depending on who tells it. The tree itself may be eternal, but its meaning has never been fixed. Scholars, poets, and historians have pulled at its branches, trying to decide whether it was literal, symbolic, or something in between. And like the roots that reach in different directions, interpretations of Yggdrasil stretch out, tangled, overlapping, never entirely neat. One debate begins with the question of the tree species. Most sources call it an ash, but some suggest it may originally have been a yew. Ash trees were tall, common, and flexible, with roots that dig deep, so it makes sense. But yew trees lived longer, sometimes for thousands of years, and they were often found in sacred groves. Yew wood is also toxic, giving it an air of mystery. Historians still argue whether Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century writer who recorded much of what we know, mistranslated or reshaped the word. Was Yggdrasil the ash tree or the yew tree? We may never know, but the debate itself shows how myths can grow from ordinary plants into cosmic pillars, a mainstream historical anchor. Sacred trees weren't just stories. Archaeological evidence and written sources describe them as real features in Germanic and Norse life. The most famous was the Irminsul of the Saxons, a great wooden pillar worshipped until it was destroyed by Charlemagne in the 8th century. Other sources mention holy groves in Scandinavia where sacrifices were made, including at Uppsala in Sweden, where a massive evergreen was said to stand beside a well. Yggdrasil, then, may have been less of an invention and more of a memory of these living shrines magnified into myth. And now, a quirky tidbit. Some scholars propose that the world tree wasn't just metaphorical, but also acted as a calendar. If you picture the tree as a vertical diagram with roots, trunk, and crown, you can map the seasons and agricultural cycles onto it. Leaves sprouting meant spring, roots freezing meant winter, and the animals climbing up and down could represent the passage of months. Whether this was intended or not, it's a strangely practical way to read a story that otherwise feels dreamlike. There are also debates about the name itself, Yggdrasil. It can be translated as Odin's horse, or the horse of the terrible one, because Ygr was one of Odin's many names, and Drasil meant horse. The phrase ties to the story where Odin sacrificed himself on the tree hanging for 9 nights, pierced by a spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. In that sense, the tree was his gallows, and in Old Norse poetry, gallows were often called the horse of the hanged. The very name of the tree, then, may be a reminder of sacrifice and pain. Historians still argue whether the myth was influenced by shamanic traditions or by later Christian ideas of crucifixion. You sit with this thought for a moment. The great cosmic tree, whose name may secretly mean the gallows of the gods. It's dark, but also strangely fitting, because Yggdrasil isn't just a friendly pillar. It's a place of wisdom gained through suffering, of endurance shaped by constant threat. Scholars also debate how much of the 9-world model was truly ancient and how much was tidied up by medieval writers. Earlier poems hint at realms, but not always in a neat set of 9. It's possible that oral storytellers shifted details depending on audience, sometimes mentioning only 3 or 4, sometimes more. Snorri, writing centuries later, may have organized them into 9 because it sounded complete. In that case, our entire modern image of Yggdrasil could be the result of one medieval man's tidy pen. And yet, tidy or not, the image resonates. A giant tree, roots drinking from wells, branches cradling realms. Animals bickering along its bark. It feels whole, even if it wasn't always described that way. You imagine sitting in a longhouse, listening to these tales passed from one voice to another. Each teller adds a detail, leaves out another, reshapes the story. For one, Yggdrasil is a literal ash rising above the village. For another, it is a map of existence. For another still, it is a memory of sacred groves long cut down. The tree grows with every retelling, its branches reaching into imagination. And as you think this through, your eyelids grow heavy. Because debates, however fascinating, don't change the fact that the tree simply is. Whether ash or yew, symbol or shrine, myth or memory, it stands. Its bark creaks, its roots drink, its leaves whisper. The arguments fade, but the hum of the tree remains steady, patient, eternal. By now, you've seen how Yggdrasil towers across myths and scholarly debates alike. But what makes it feel truly alive is how its image bled into everyday Norse life. The world tree wasn't just a story whispered at feasts or inscribed in the Edda. Its shadow stretched across farming fields. Rituals, laws, and even the little habits of villagers scattered across Scandinavia. Imagine a Norse farmer standing in his yard, watching the seasons turn. When he looked at his homestead, his longhouse at the center, the fence circling it, the animals gathered close, he was really looking at a miniature Midgard. The world tree's structure wasn't distant or abstract. It echoed in the way people built and lived. The cosmos was a mirror of the village, and the village was a mirror of the cosmos. A mainstream historical anchor. We know from medieval chronicles that many communities had sacred trees or poles planted in the center of their gathering places. In Iceland, for instance, when settlers arrived, they sometimes threw carved high-seat pillars into the sea, and built their farm where the wood washed ashore, then dedicated a tree or pole to mark that spot. This echoes Yggdrasil's role as the axis mundi, the central pillar around which everything else turned. In rituals, too, the tree appeared. Sacrifices, whether of animals, weapons, or even people, were sometimes made near sacred groves or hanging trees. The act of hanging, grim as it is, tied directly to Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil. To give something up beneath a tree was to mirror the god's own offerings, reinforcing the connection between daily worship and cosmic myth. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some village assemblies, called things, were held outdoors beneath large trees. The idea was practical. The shade kept people cool but also symbolic. Beneath the branches, disputes were settled, laws recited, and decisions made. The rustling leaves overhead may have reminded them of the Norns weaving, fate hovering invisibly above. In that sense, every legal decision became a small reenactment of the god's own counsels at Yggdrasil's roots. Even farming reflected the myth. When ploughing in spring, villagers could think of themselves as helping Yggdrasil's roots drink from hidden wells. When cutting timber, they might whisper small prayers, acknowledging the tree that held up the world. Historians still argue whether these connections were conscious or unconscious. But the overlap between myth and daily rhythm is hard to ignore. And then there were the quiet, domestic echoes. The fire in the hearth, warm, central, life-giving, could be imagined as Muspelheim's flame, carefully controlled. The icy drafts that crept through the door in winter carried whispers of Nibelheim. Children who climbed trees in play were unknowingly imitating Ratatoska, darting between realms. The cosmos was not distant. It was folded into every corner of life. In some ways, Yggdrasil also acted as a calendar. Farmers marked time by the growth of trees' buds in spring, leaves in summer, shedding in autumn. The eternal greenness of Yggdrasil, as described in sagas, became a kind of ideal. A world where the tree never withered, even when earthly branches did. That promise of constancy was a comfort in a world where winters were long and summers short. Historians still debate how much of this was explicitly mythic, and how much was simply cultural bleed-through. Did every farmer ploughing a field think, "I am echoing Yggdrasil"? Probably not. But myths are like roots themselves, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible, always feeding the surface. Picture an autumn night in a Norse village. The harvest is done, the animals brought inside. Outside, a tall ash or yew tree creaks in the wind. Families gather in the longhouse, smoke curling upward through the roof hole, telling stories of the world tree. The children listen with wide eyes, imagining the roots stretching under their very floorboards, the branches reaching beyond the stars. The elders nod, reminded that their daily work feeding goats, mending fences, chopping firewood was part of that same cosmic structure. And as you picture this, you realize that Yggdrasil's importance was not in its grandeur, but in its familiarity. It was not only the axis of the universe, it was also the axis of home. You lean back against the bark again, feeling its rough texture. Overhead, branches creak softly, like rafters in a hall. For a moment, you almost believe you are sitting not beneath myth, but beneath your own roof. The line between daily life and cosmic myth fades, just as it must have for those who first told the stories. You've traveled from root to crown, through wells, realms, animals, and rituals. And now the story draws toward its darkest and perhaps most fascinating moment. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Even Yggdrasil, so tall and enduring, was not immune to this end. In the Norse imagination, the tree shuddered when fate itself unraveled, groaning under the weight of collapse, branches thrashing as the worlds it held together cracked apart. The vision of Ragnarok is not sudden, it builds, like tension stored in the tree's fibers for centuries. The first signs are small. Brothers turning on brothers. Winters lasting far longer than they should. Wolves prowling closer. Then the skies darken, stars vanish, and the great wolf Fenrir breaks his bonds. Jarmungandr, the Midgard serpent, stirs, rising from the sea, waves crashing high over Midgard's fences. Surtur, the fire giant from Muspelheim, marches with his flaming sword, brighter than the sun, ready to set the world ablaze, and Yggdrasil trembles. Not a gentle creak this time, but a violent shaking, bark splitting, leaves tearing loose. The eagle at the top beats its wings in alarm. Ratatoskr, no longer mischievous but frantic, dashes wildly, unable to contain the chaos. The stags bolt, their antlers snapping branches. Below, unhggr, and the serpents writhe in frenzy, gnawing deeper, desperate. The Norns themselves, sitting by the well of fate, are silent because, at this point, there is no weaving left to do. The threads are already cut, a mainstream historical anchor. Ragnarok wasn't simply a story of destruction. Archaeologists and historians see it as reflecting the Norse relationship with cycles. Winters destroyed crops, but spring returned. Kings fell, but new ones rose. Even the cosmos, in their vision, had to die in order to be renewed. Ragnarok was less about apocalypse and more about recycling destruction followed by rebirth. Here's a quirky tidbit. One poem suggests that after the fire and flood of Ragnarok, A single tree, called Rossa, provided shelter to two humans, Liffy and Yggdrasil, who would emerge to repopulate the earth. Some scholars believe this tree was Yggdrasil itself, offering refuge even as everything else collapsed. So, while Yggdrasil shook and cracked, it may also have been the very thing that protected the seeds of renewal. Imagine that the tree both destroyed and savior, landlord and lifeboat. Historians still argue whether Ragnarok was an original Norse myth or whether it was reshaped by Christian scribes who wanted to give pagan stories an apocalyptic twist. Some see echoes of the biblical revelation in its fire, its floods, its new heaven and earth. Others insist the story is uniquely Norse, rooted in the cycles of harsh winters and fragile summers, where destruction always felt close at hand. But for the storyteller's audience, Ragnarok was less about theological debate and more about drama. They could picture Thor battling Jarmungandr, each killing the other. They could see Odin swallowed by Fenrir. They could hear Heimdall blowing his horn, summoning gods to their last stand. And in the background, they could sense Yggdrasil shaking violently, the stage itself breaking apart. And yet after the shaking, after the fire, after the floods, the image softens. A new world rises, green again, fresh again. Survivors step out into the light. The gods' children rebuild. And somewhere, faintly, Yggdrasil remains. Perhaps scarred, perhaps smaller, perhaps with fewer leaves, but still there, still anchoring the new cycle. You pause with this thought. Maybe the power of Yggdrasil's myth wasn't that it promised eternal safety, but that it promised continuity. Even if everything falls, something endures. Even if gods die, life creeps back. Even if bark cracks and roots splinter, sap rises once more. The tree hums faintly again under your hand. It has shaken, it has burned, it has been gnawed, and yet it whispers that balance returns. You realize that, in its own way, Yggdrasil is the perfect bedtime story. Not because it's comforting in the ordinary sense, but because it's honest. Things end, things begin again. And through it all, something steady hums beneath, holding the weight until you drift to sleep. And now, as the story of Yggdrasil closes, let the pace slow down. Imagine the tree not shaking with doom, but swaying gently, its branches rocking like a cradle in the breeze. The leaves, still green, drift softly overhead, each one carrying away a scrap of worry or thought. You no longer see gods or giants or serpents, you only hear the low rustle, the sound of branches moving against sky. The ground beneath you feels steady, warmer than stone, softer than wood. You lean against the trunk, and the bark no longer scratches. It simply holds you, firm and patient. The pulse you felt earlier, that hum running through roots and trunk, now matches your own heartbeat. It slows, evens out, becomes steady. The wells grow quiet. No dripping, no weaving, no bubbling. Just calm water, still and reflective. The Norns have set aside their spindles for the night. Ratatoska has curled up somewhere in a nook, his tail flicking once before he finally sleeps. Even Ni Hggr, restless gnaw of roots, seems to pause, coils loosening, jaws shutting. The entire cosmos exhales. You imagine the 9 realms dimming one by one, like lanterns being gently covered. Asgard's golden roofs fade into a glow. Midgard's fences melt into shadow. Jotunheim's icy cliffs dissolve into mist. Hell becomes softer, less cold, a place of rest rather than dread. Muspelheim's fire lowers to embers. Niflheim's frost drifts into quiet snow. Each realm quiets, each sound slows. Now it is only you and the tree. And even the tree feels smaller, kinder, less overwhelming. Its leaves whisper you toward sleep. Its roots anchor you, so nothing can shift beneath your rest. The world can wait, the myths can pause. For tonight, all that matters is stillness.